Jacob Miller was a private in Company K, 9th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. He wasn't a general, nor a man with political clout. He was a farm boy from Indiana who shouldered a musket, marched where he was told, and endured the same hunger, mud, and fear as thousands of other soldiers. But what set him apart was a single moment at Chickamauga when fate tried to cut him down, and somehow missed. Jacob was born in August of 1840 in Logansport, Cass County, Indiana, to George and Elizabeth Miller. His family worked the land like most Midwesterners of the time, farming, cutting timber, and scraping out a living in a country that was still growing westward. Jacob had little education beyond the basics, but he had strong hands and a steady back. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, patriotism swept through Indiana towns, and Jacob, just 21 years old, joined the 9th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. The 9th Indiana quickly gained a reputation as a fighting regiment. They marched into western Virginia early in the war, fought at Shiloh in 1862, and stood in the brutal combat at Stones River in 1863. Among their ranks was Ambrose Bierce, the young soldier who would later become one of America's great writers, and who would describe Chickamauga as one of the most nightmarish battlefields he ever saw. By September 1863, Jacob and the 9th Indiana were part of the Army of the Cumberland under General William Rosecrans. The Union Army had pushed into North Georgia, aiming to cut off Confederate rail lines, but they met fierce resistance from General Braxton Bragg's Confederate forces. On the morning of September 19th, the fog hung low over Chickamauga Creek. The forested terrain meant soldiers often couldn't see more than a few dozen yards. Commands were shouted, volleys cracked, and men sometimes fired blindly into the smoke. Near a clearing called Brock Field, the 9th Indiana moved forward. Confederates surged out of the trees, muskets blazing. The lines clashed in deafening thunder. It was in this storm of fire that Jacob Miller was struck. A musket ball smashed directly into his forehead, right between his eyes. To the men around him, it was the kind of wound no one survived. Captain of Company K looked down at him and said to the others, "It's no use to remove poor Miller, for he is dead." His comrades left him where he fell, believing there was nothing to be done. But Jacob did not die. Many years later, in 1911, he relayed the memory in a Joliet, Illinois newspaper interview. "At last I became conscious and raised up in a sitting position. Then I began to feel my wound. I found my left eye out of its place and tried to place it back, but I had to move the crushed bone back as near together as I could first. Then I got the eye in its proper place. I then bandaged the eye the best I could with my bandana." Miller's other eye was so swollen he could see nothing. Though blinded, he crawled through the battlefield over the dead and tried to make his way toward Union lines. Fearful of being taken prisoner by the Confederates, he forced himself up and set out on a 15-mile journey toward Chattanooga. Miller could only see a few feet ahead of him by holding open the lids of the swollen eye. At some point he collapsed along the roadside and passed out. A man on horseback came upon him, picked him up, and carried him to Chattanooga, where he finally had his wound dressed. In excruciating pain, Miller begged every doctor he saw to remove the bullet. Surgeons were sure Miller would die if the bullet were removed, so they left it in until he reached home. When he finally reached his home in Logansport, Indiana, Doctors Graham Fitch and Henry Coleman agreed to attempt the surgery. They succeeded in removing about 1/3 of the musket ball, but much of it remained. Jacob would later recall, 17 years after I was wounded, a buckshot dropped out of my wound, and 31 years after, 2 pieces of lead came out." It's important to pause here and understand what medical care looked like in 1863. Anesthesia was crude, mostly chloroform or ether. Infection was poorly understood, and antiseptic practice was rare. For head wounds, especially one between the eyes, surgeons often gave up. In fact, most men hit in the head by musket balls died outright or lingered only hours. Other soldiers had bizarre survivals, too. One Confederate officer was shot through the mouth and lived. A Union soldier carried a bullet in his heart until his death years later. But Jacob's wound was visible to all, an open scar on his forehead that never truly healed. People could see the hole across a room. Back home, Jacob's family had already mourned him. His captain had reported him dead, and his name was printed in newspapers among the killed. 2 months later, friends and family finally received word from Miller that he was alive. Jacob was never truly free of his injuries. He suffered constant pain, strange fits of madness, and spells where he wandered aimlessly, unable to recall names, but vividly remembering every detail of the day he was shot. As he told reporters years later, "Some might ask how it is I can describe so minutely my getting wounded and getting off the battlefield after so many years. My answer is, I have an everyday reminder of it in my wound and constant pain in the head, never free of it while not asleep. The whole scene is imprinted on my brain as with a steel engraving." He received a pension from the government and could not work because of his wound. Though the injury prevented him from steady physical labor, he provided as best he could and remained a respected figure in his community. He lived in Will County, around the towns of Braidwood and Wilmington, coal country, where rough lives and hard labor were the rule. Though Jacob couldn't join the miners in their work, he was a known figure in the community, the soldier who had walked away from Chickamauga with death stamped on his forehead. Jacob Miller lived more than half a century beyond the day he should have died. At last, on January 13th, 1917, he passed away at the age of 88. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Wilmington, Illinois. His grave is modest, but his story remains one of the most astonishing survivals of the Civil War. Jacob's story matters because it gives flesh and blood to the staggering numbers. Chickamauga was the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, but Jacob's survival shows us that war did not end when the musket fire stopped. For some men, the war lived on in their bodies, in scars, in pain, in madness, for the rest of their days. He was not a general, not a famous leader. He was a farmer, a husband, a father. He was reported dead, mourned, and yet he lived on, with a hole in his head, with fragments of lead that surfaced decades later, with the kind of pain most men could not endure. Jacob Miller proved that survival itself could be a kind of heroism. A musket ball between the eyes should have ended him. Instead, he lived long enough to tell his story, and in telling it, gave us one of the clearest, most haunting windows into what it meant to survive the Civil War. Thank you for watching, and thank you for the support. See you next time on the Hillbilly Files.